It wasn't a grand revelation or a sudden leap. It was a quiet stirring, a spark of guidance that reminded her she still had something to give. She walked home that evening with flowers still clinging to her clothes, but her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The idea of opening her own bakery seemed impossible at first, like trying to build a bridge out of paper. Still, the memory of those smiling faces at the community bake sale lingered in her heart, and the warmth of that day carried her through the fear. With trembling hands, she began sketching plans in a notebook, jotting down recipes, names, and even a rough budget. It was a fragile dream, but it was hers. The road was not smooth, her savings were thin, and the thought of investing them into ovens and flour felt reckless. Some friends cautioned her, saying it was too risky, that she should keep applying for safe jobs instead. Their voices echoed her own doubts, amplifying the fear that she was chasing something foolish. But Mrs. Green's quiet encouragement stood against the noise. She reminded her that success isn't always found on the straight path, and sometimes it is born from courage in the crooked places. She started small, baking in her apartment kitchen, selling loaves and pastries to neighbors and at the local farmers market. The nights were long, often stretching until dawn, and her hands ached from kneading. Yet, unlike the endless office work she once endured, this exhaustion carried joy. It was the kind that came from creating, from pouring her soul into something real. Little by little, word spread. People came not just for the bread, but for the care they could taste in every bite. Her kitchen became too small to hold the demand, and with trembling determination, she signed the lease on a tiny corner shop. Standing in the empty space, with bare walls and echoes of possibility, she felt both terrified and alive. The first day her bakery opened, the shelves were filled with warm bread, golden croissants, and sweet rolls that carried the scent of comfort out into the street. She watched as people gathered, as children pointed excitedly at pastries, as strangers sat by the window and smiled with each bite. In that moment, she realized the truth. Losing her job had not ended her life. It had opened the door to the one she was meant to live. She no longer carried the weight of failure. Instead, she carried the quiet strength of someone who had faced the ashes of despair and found the courage to build something beautiful from them. Her bakery wasn't just a business, it was proof that every challenge hides an opportunity, waiting to be discovered by those willing to see beyond the loss. Life often disguises its greatest gifts in the wrapping of hardship. What looks like loss may in truth be the soil from which new beginnings grow. Her journey reminds us that courage does not always rot, sometimes begins as a whisper, guiding us to take one small step toward the unknown. And when we dare to follow, we often find that failure was never the end, but the beginning of something greater. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and renewal. The news came on a quiet Friday afternoon, carried not by thunder but by a simple email that shattered her world. After nearly a decade of working in the same office, she was let go with just a few words about restructuring and downsizing. At first, she stared at the screen, her heart pounding as though the words themselves had weight. She read them again and again, but they never changed. They didn't soften. They didn't explain why it had to be her. The following days blurred into one another. She moved through her small apartment like a ghost, each room echoing with the silence of her doubts. The kitchen, once a place of comfort where she baked on weekends to soothe herself, now felt foreign. The scent of flour and butter no longer carried warmth, only reminders of a past when life seemed steady. She kept asking herself what she had done wrong, what flaw made her expendable. It wasn't just the loss of income that weighed on her, it was the collapse of identity. Work had been her rhythm, her reason to wake up early, her anchor. Without it, she felt adrift, floating in an endless sea of uncertainty. She thought of her parents, who had always believed she was on a stable path, and the disappointment she imagined in their eyes stung worse than the pink slip itself. Each rejection letter from new applications pierced deeper, whispering that perhaps she was no longer good enough, perhaps she had never been. Nights stretched long, with sleep rarely coming, and when it did, it was restless. She would wake with a heavy chest, as if carrying invisible stones that grew heavier each day. Friends tried to console her, telling her everything happened for a reason, but their words slipped off her like rain on glass. She smiled when they called, but the moment the line went silent, tears returned. She began to believe her world had ended the moment that email arrived. Yet beneath all that despair, a tiny ember still flickered. It showed itself when she passed by the little bakery downtown, where the golden scent of fresh bread spilled out onto the street. For just a moment, she would pause, inhaling deeply, remembering the joy she once felt in her own kitchen. Then, ashamed of her longing, she would walk on, convincing herself that dreams were for people braver than her. She didn't know it yet, but this was not the end. It was the silent beginning of something she could not yet imagine. One morning, when the weight of her failure pressed especially hard, she wandered out of her apartment with no destination in mind. Her steps carried her past the familiar bakery again, where the scent of rising dough wrapped around her like a forgotten comfort. She stood still, breathing it in, when a gentle voice broke the moment. It was Mrs. Green, her elderly neighbor, who had lived in the building for decades. She invited her to sit on the bench outside the cafe, her eyes kind but sharp enough to see the sadness she was hiding. Mrs. Green had a way of speaking that felt like pouring, teasily steady and warm. She listened as the younger woman spoke of her job loss, the endless rejection letters, the nights heavy with doubt. There was no judgment in her silence, only presence. When she finally spoke, her words were simple, yet carried weight. She said life has a habit of wrapping gifts in strange paper, and sometimes what we think is an ending is merely an unopened door. The words lingered long after their talk ended. That evening, she found herself pulling out an old recipe book she hadn't touched in years. The pages were worn, flour-dusted, and filled with her handwritten notes. As she traced the ink with her fingers, a forgotten warmth stirred in her chest. Memories surfaced of childhood afternoons, baking cookies with her grandmother, of laughter filling the kitchen, of the quiet joy that came with watching others smile as they tasted her creations. Yet doubt quickly returned, whispering that baking was only a hobby, not a life. She worried about money, about failing again, about being laughed at. But Mrs. Green's words would not leave her. An unopened door. Perhaps this loss was more than just emptiness. Perhaps it was space being cleared for something new. The next week, she accepted Mrs. Green's invitation to help with a small community bake sale. Nervous but curious, she spent hours kneading dough, her hands working with both fear and excitement. When the bread came out golden and warm, she watched strangers taste it and smile. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of pride. A voice inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was where she belonged.